O Lord of hosts, be with us, for we have none other help in times of adversity but thee. O Lord of hosts, have mercy on us.
All right, so now let me get into my criticisms of democracy. Here's the problems with democracy. Number one, as we've already talked about, is the rule of law. Is everybody equal under the rule of law in America? This, for the Athenians and the founding fathers, was essential to live in a sort of democratic citizenship. I would say we don't. So at least for the first principle in regards to the problems of democracy, if there's certain elite, certain noble families, certain aristocratic groups that are outside the confines of the law, well, then you are no longer in a democracy because it's a rule for thee and not for me, which clearly we see is the case in the United States. The law of the United States does not apply to everyone equally. And therefore, at least from that fundamental principle, that is undemocratic. And so when we look at it from a law standpoint, we do not have a democratic representatives that are all under the same rule of law. Blue Skittle just threw in $5, says, Dono chat not working for me. Dono chat's not working? I don't know what's going on, guys. I wouldn't be surprised. Like I said, it's one of those days. Everything that could go wrong seems to continue to go wrong. But we're here and we're getting through the stream, so I hope you guys are enjoying the content. But thank you very much, Blue Skittle, for the $5 super chat. I don't know what's going on with Dono chat. I have no idea. I don't know what's going on with my camera. I don't know what's going on with all the technology today. So first problem with democracy is everybody under the same rule of law? We've already established, and I think it's quite clear to see, whether it be in Britain, whether it be in Europe. I mean, I've already given the instance of Epstein in America. We know that some of the most powerful people in our country, including former presidents, have been associated with Epstein and many of the practices that were going on Epstein Island. Have any of them been held accountable? Will any of them ever be held accountable? Of course not. Of course not. So do we live in a democracy? At least not for the first principle, which is everybody under the same rule of law. Second one is mob rule. This is a big criticism of democracy. And this is something that I think is becoming a problem with America, although we could say that the silent majority, right, that whether it be the MAGA people or the people that support Trump or just patriotic Americans, it does seem, at least, again, I'm biased. I'm in the Midwest, so I'm surrounded by these people. That is the majority rule. But when we look at the reasons why they're flooding the country with illegal immigrants, and we saw recently, I don't know if you guys saw this past week, that the flyers that are being given to illegal immigrants in Mexico before they cross the border literally says to vote for Joe Biden so that the border can be maintained open. This is an attempt to rule by the mob, right? They're bringing in voters. Part of the illegal immigration, I would speculate, is that they want them to serve in the military and be a sort of domestic police force. That seems to be possible, especially with senators like Menendez already saying that they want the illegals to be part of the U.S. military. But just to bring more people in for mob rule. Now, who has the power over the minority? And I would say in the U.S., at least as of right now, it's the minority that has the power over the majority. And they are terrified to relinquish that power because they know that they may not get it. If we lived in a state, in a country that had fair and free elections, I think the outcomes would be very different than what we're told for the last decade or so. So another part of the mob rule that the Athenians were worried about is the uneducated populace. So the reasons why the Athenians were not worried about quote unquote mob rule and that the assembly had all the power is they believed that free Athenian Greek men were well educated. And because of that, they were able to make wise decisions. As we said, they have a shared sacred canopy, a shared national ethos, a shared perspective of the future. And therefore, the citizenry was well educated and therefore could make valuable decisions. And so for them, the mob rule wasn't necessarily a problem. But when we get to another point, which I'll just skip to, which is the influence of the media and propaganda. So this is one of the third problems with democracies is, right, we have three branches of government: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial, right? But I think it's quite accurate, as people have highlighted, that the fourth branch of government is the mainstream media. And so the Athenians thought that their populace was well educated, at least the people that were able to participate in democracy. Are the people in America that are participating in democracy well educated? Meaning that they really know the issues, they really know what's going on, they have truthful information? Of course not. Of course not. And this is deliberate. So one of the other problems, along with rule of law and mob rule in regards to democracy, is the influence of media and propaganda, that people aren't informed. Now, if we lived in a real democratic structure, the goal would be to truthfully inform the populace as much as possible so that they could have an accurate agency over the structure of government. But we know that that is actually the opposite of what the media is interested in. And so we live in a point in which people are more misinformed or ill-informed than ever before. And so we have more news agencies, we have more ways to gather information. We live in the information age, and yet people are more misinformed than ever before. How can we have a democracy if people are ill-informed? And so the media then can create right and wrong think. This is why the media is so powerful. And can you truly have a democracy if the media is able to sway public opinion so significantly in creating social pressure for opinions, right? The point of an educated and informed populace is that you can make accurate decisions. But if we are being pressured to have right or wrong think, and if you have wrong think, then you can be ostracized, you can be fired from your job, you can be ostracized from your community. Well, then this is exerting a new force of pressure that is really anti-democratic. Because how could the demos, the populace, the people, perform their duties if yet their opinions are being pressured and swayed by propaganda and misinformation? And if you say something that goes against the general narrative and consensus, you then can be punished. Well, that is anti-democratic. And so isn't it irony? But this is the point of evil, right? Evil, they always accuse you of what they are doing, because it's a form of inversion, right? So we see Hillary Clinton do this all the time, right? So the things that she's guilty of, she will say somebody else is doing, because that forces the uneducated observer to look at the accusation towards the person that she points at, and then she is like the shadow behind a light, right? If you have a flashlight, the darkest place to be is right behind the light. And I would say that that's the same thing that's done with evil in regards to accusing people of exactly what you're doing, is so that the flashlight shines and you behind the flashlight are actually in the darkest part. So the eyes are not on you. People do not see you. They see where the flashlight is directed, where the accusation is pointed. And so we live in a state in which the media is deliberately misinforming the populace. Is that democratic? Absolutely not. Number 4 is a two-party system. I am not the one to bring this up. This has been brought up by many political scientists that highlight that you cannot actually exert a legitimate democracy within a two-party system, because a two-party system is entirely inefficient and can be easily corrupted, because a two-party system limits the voice and the options of the demos, the populace. If there's only two parties to choose from, then even participating in the democratic electoral cycle is already augmented, because you can only choose between two options that are already structured and limited. And so what do we have in the United States? We have a two-party system. Whereas in Europe, and I'm not here to be in favor of European politics, that's certainly not it either, but at least they have more parties that they can choose from. We in the United States do not. And so the two-party system is entirely inefficient, and again is anti-democratic, because it limits the options and the voice of the people. And when we looked at the founding fathers, they had more than two parties when the country founded. The founding fathers would be horrified by the current state of the Republican and Democrat Party. I mean, it's ridiculous. We got a couple super chats that just came in. Crashman throws in $5. Thank you so much, Crashman. He says the central banks. Now you figure out who controls the central banks. Man, that was so real because we know the answer off the top of our heads. I'll leave that to you guys. Thank you so much, Crashman, for the $5 super chat. And Pim Orsov throws in $10. Thank you so much, Pim. He says, if conspiracy is a secret agreement among several people against another, is democracy conspiratorial? That's an interesting question. Well, I think, and let me put it this way, based on the question you framed, Pim, is the stereotyping and the negative connotation of conspiracy part of an anti-democratic endeavor, right? If let's just grant your premise instead of trying to come down on a decision. If democracy it really is conspiratorial because it's about the masses conspiring what to do against the government itself, it would make sense why the power that is would want to limit and ostracize and demonize conspiracies themselves. Does that make sense? I'm just throwing that out there. But I think you make an interesting point around, is democracy conspiratorial? Because technically that's what it should be. It should be if democracy was ideal and if we lived in a truly democratic society, people would go to public places, public squares. They would go to their local communities and they would conspire amongst each other about what they're going to do for their local officials. And then with their local officials, they would conspire about what they're going to do for their federal officials. That makes sense. That makes a little bit of sense. So if you then criticize conspiracy, it seems like you're playing right into the hand of limiting democratic voicing. So great point, Pim. Great point, man. You killed it there. Okay, so let me continue on here. In regards to, again, these are criticisms of democracy that I'm going through right now. So we've already said rule of law. Does everybody live under the same rule necessary for democracy? No, we don't. Mob rule, which is always a potential detriment, but mob rule can be good if you have a homogeneous, well-informed populace, which we don't. Two-party system, which is problematic, and that's exactly what we have. And many political scientists, this isn't my opinion, have highlighted that a two-party system is highly inefficient and easily corrupted, which is exactly what we have. And we highlighted the influence of the media, because within a democratic society, the role of the media is to best inform the people and actually put pressure on powerful positions. But we see that our media is actually ruled by the powerful and is trying to sway and misinform people so that they cannot make an accurate decision. So we have then 5 points so far, and so far, all of them we've highlighted that they actually are undermined in the American context. Now, another point, and this is a very, very important point about democracy, is its long-term stability. There is no long-term historical example of a democratic institution. Athens lasted for 200 years, and Athens was highly local and highly homogenous in regards to who was able to participate in it. So we in the U.S. are the oldest living democracy right now, and we are not an old country. And this is one of the problems I'll bring up in regards to this long-term stability, is that it's so short-sighted. This is not my opinion. Other political scientists have highlighted this about democracies and democratic elections, is that because in democratic nations, people are so focused on being reelected, their only emphasis is on making sure they get votes for the next election cycle. And therefore, as a nation, who is looking at the nation in regards to a 100-year plan? Nobody is. And so when you look at the interview between Vladimir Putin and Tucker Carlson, which we covered, and the first 30 minutes of that discussion is Vladimir Putin basically laying out the 1,000-year history of the Rus people since their conversion to Orthodoxy and the geopolitical situation of Ukraine from that period and the importance of Kiev to the Rus people and the Slavs, that is because those people have a historical identity. They have an historical identity. Same thing as with China. Now, I'm not in favor of the capitalistic communism of the CCP. But the point is, because of the ways in which their government is structured, and this is a criticism that China levies at the West, is because of our political structure, they are able to think about the future within the next 10, 20, 50 years. They're already making plans for after Xi Jinping's death. They already are making plans on what the nation's going to do and what directions. It came out that they have a 100-year plan for the destruction of America. In America, in Western European societies, nobody is looking for the long-term goal. Everything is short-sighted. And this is another major criticism and fundamental blemish of democratic nation states, is because the people in power and the representatives are so focused on getting reelected, nobody is looking at the nation and looking out for its interest on a long-term vision. And I think that is why no democracy is able to exist for that long of a period. No democracy is able to exist for a long extended. No, the Byzantine Empire is over 1,000 years. It's the longest empire in world history. That could not happen if it was democratic, because it can't have a long enough vision to look and move through the future. And so there's no long-term shared vision of history or geopolitics in America. And this is one of the problems. Even if we look at Russia, one of the big differences, and Russia is multilingual and multicultural, right? We have the Chechenians and the Dagestanians and all these different people, right, that are in Russia proper. But in America, we don't have any identity. What does it mean to be American? What does it mean to support American ideals? Well, depending on who you are and who you ask, the answer differs quite significantly. So therefore, we don't even have a shared ethos. We don't have a shared perspective, and we do not even have a shared long-term vision. Some people literally in the country right now are shouting death to America. Now, again, America is so corrupt that I think the ending of whatever it is that it's doing right now isn't necessarily a bad thing. But the point is, people with U.S. passports that are being brought as U.S. citizens literally are articulating the destruction and the death of the country itself. Henry just threw in $10. He says, what is your opinion on DIM and of the faction in the Orthodox Church that criticizes and downplays the monarchical history of New Rome and the Tsarist Russia cause? My USA, my us, or United States, is the best in democracy. Henry, I'm a little confused on what exactly you're saying. What is your opinion of DIM and of the faction in the Orthodox Church that criticizes and downplays the monarchical history of New Rome? Well, I don't know exactly who is doing that. But so I guess it's a little bit too general for me to give a specific reference to, but I mean, yeah, the U.S. democracy is a joke. I mean, we don't really live in a democratic institution, so I agree with you there. And according to Orthodox prophecies, which we'll cover in another stream, Russia is going to play a very central role in the promotion and a catalyst for the expansion of Orthodoxy around the world. And potentially, according to some saints, the reconquering of Constantinople and eventually giving that back to the Greeks. So that's been prophesied by many saints. So I'm not sure what exactly, I don't know who you're talking about in regards to the faction of the Orthodox Church that criticizes or downplays monarchical history. I think, again, we can't, if you live in a Western country and you're an Orthodox Christian, you can't exactly just create a monarchy. And so I think it's wishful thinking. I think it's very wishful and naive that because you're an Orthodox Christian, most people, which are converts, think that, okay, well, now I'm a convert to Orthodoxy and I've learned a little bit about Byzantium, that we need to institute a monarchy in America. Maybe that'll happen after the Great World War, because that's what we're getting ready to enter, is World War III. And the Great World War is going to reset global power and structures. And so who knows what America is going to look like after the Great War. But yeah, I don't know. But I do appreciate the $10 super chat, Henry. God bless you, brother. Thank you very much. And we got a handful of super chats over on the Streamlabs. Orpheus throws in $5, no comment. Thank you so much, Orpheus. Store 96 throws in $10 and says, just wanted to say thank you for everything you do. My whole family is getting baptized on Lazarus Saturday. Well, glory to God. Store 66. That's great to hear. Also, I don't know why people still believe in presidential elections. They're super fake and gray. Well, obviously we know, again, it's controversial to say in regards to TOS here on YouTube, but yeah, I agree with you. That's another point we're getting ready to get to, is that a necessity for democracy is fair and free elections. I'm not going to make any explicit claims because we're live on YouTube, but I'll just ask you guys whether free and fair elections even exist in America or in the West, generally speaking. Certainly one of the most easiest ways to secure an election would be voter ID and paper ballots, of which our country does not do. So I agree with you, Store 96, and glory to God, and God bless you and your family for getting baptized. Next one came in from Frankie D, throws in $3. He says, I would argue that the conspirator class does have 100 or even a century-long plan. It's just not for the plebs. They have their agenda 2020s and 2030s. One could argue that these Fabian socialists have a multi-century long plan and conspiracy. Yes, absolutely, Frankie D. I totally agree with that. The Agenda 21, the Great Reset, the Anglo-American Empire. Jay's covered the books that the elites have been writing for the last century. Absolutely, they've had their own plan. My point was in regards to nation states and democracy. So, yeah, I totally concede and agree with you in regards to the elites having a long-term plan. But my point was the problems and the ills of democracy is that democracy actually prevents that nation state having a long-term vision because it's so focused on the next election cycle. So do the elites that run these democratic Western nations have a long-term plan? Absolutely. It's the New World Order. Of course. It's a one-world government. It's the consolidation of all their powers and doing away with nation states so that they don't have to worry about the plebs. So I totally agree with you there, Frankie D. So thank you very much, brother, for that super chat. And John Anand throws in another $5. He said, Joe Biden's new campaign slogan is death to America. That'd be probably the truest thing he's ever said if he did run on that. So thank you very much, John Anand. Really appreciate that, my man. Okay, let me get through now the rest of my criticisms here in regards to democracy. So we've already hit it: the rule of law, mob rule, long-term stability, two-party system, the influence of the media. And now I want to get to bribery and corruption. So if we lived in a truly democratic society, we would try to limit bribery and corruption to the greatest degree so that our political representatives, who are our representatives who represent our will to control the government, because only the representatives can control our government, not the people, that we would do everything in our power to limit bribery and corruption. Do we do that? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. We can look at the lobbyists and the influence of political policy in America and see how corporations, big pharma, Israel, the military industrial complex, they actually influence the representatives way more than the constituents themselves. So that is another undermining critical factor of democracy, because we live in a society that is totally run by bribery and corruption. Another one would be blackmail. If we truly lived in a democratic nation and people were living to their highest ideals and moral states, then we wouldn't have political leaders that are constantly being blackmailed, again, a la Epstein, a la P. Diddy, a la, again, Mossad, and what they've done for in regards to finding out what some of the degenerate behavior of our political elites do. That would be limited. But in fact, that's the modus operandi of our country. As Whitney Webb has highlighted, and was it A Nation Under Blackmail? That's exactly what America is. The reason why you actually get elevated, a reason why the super PACs and the donor class will elevate you to become the next Republican candidate for whatever district in Texas or Indiana or whatever state it is because they already have the blackmail. They already have you in their pockets. They can already get you to do what they want. So therefore, bribery and corruption is supposed to be one of the things that a true democracy is trying to limit at its greatest degree. And we already see that we have lobbyists and we have a blackmail enterprise in our country. And therefore, as I mentioned earlier, our politicians are acquiring more and more wealth through the stock market. So they then know what the policies they're going to make. They go ahead and invest in those companies. Then they enforce those policies by getting the votes. And now all of a sudden they make an enormous return. And it's just a miracle that, Nancy Pelosi makes what, 6 figures, 200 some thousand a year. And yet her and her husband are worth millions of dollars. Well, how did that happen? Because it's all corrupt and is built on bribery. So there's another one. There's the sixth one, the criticism of democracy that we don't have. As we said, number 7 is fair and free elections. Fair and free elections. These are foundational to all democracies. In Athens, it was clear because all the men present are the ones that voted. You could see who voted. The votes were not, and then they would count them in front of the whole assembly. So everybody knew that if you casted a vote, that your vote was going to count because it was all done in front of the people. A serious nation would have paper ballots and would limit at least non-foreign citizens from participating, but we don't even have that in our country. So we don't even have that in the United States. We literally allow dead people and foreign illegals to vote in this country. Arizona, for people, I saw the conservatives were praising Arizona reformed their election policy. What comes out from it is that, you have to have voter ID to vote for the state of Arizona. But if you don't, you can vote in federal elections. What? So they reformed the voting process. You have to have a state ID to vote in Arizona for the state, but you can be an illegal alien and you can vote in the federal election. That's not a reform. That's not a fair and free election. So therefore, we don't have that. So therefore, if we don't even have a fair and free election, how can we call it a democracy? It's not. It's not. The PACs and the donors control who the representatives are. It's not a fair and free election. Number 8 is non-democratically controlled institutions. One of the big differences between Athens and America in regards to democratically controlled institutions is that they controlled the military. The assembly controlled the military. They could decide because it was their tribes, it was their brothers, it was their sons that were going to go fight in war. In the U.S., we have things called the intelligence agencies, NSA, the CIA, the FBI. Who does the electorate, do they control the intelligence agencies? Of course not. Of course not. So unlike Athens, in the American context, we have an entire bodies of government institutions that are totally unaccountable to any sort of democratic election or populace at all. And so the American intelligence agencies can do whatever they want. They can literally arrest and prosecute the demos, the populace, the citizenry, and they have no recourse to it. They can label you a domestic terrorist. They can go to your trad Catholic mass and say, well, I heard you say something that was critical of Joe Biden, and we think that is part of white supremacy, and sudden we got to raid your house. That's not a democracy. We don't have that. If we actually lived in a democracy, we would have some type of recourse with the intelligence agencies, which we have none. We have none. Number 9, the lack of transparency. This has been brought up by other political scholars in regards to the growth of democratic nations, is that the bureaucratic structure of democratic nations becomes so vast that it lacks total transparency, which was another foundational element of democracy, and that the citizenry would be able to vote in certain ways. We don't have transparency. We don't even know what our government is doing. We don't know where the money is going. We see, what was it? The DOJ had how many trillions of dollars they can't account for? Did you see recently? I saw just this tax. I just did my taxes, sending a bunch of money to the government, right? And then I see an article that the IRS is missing millions and millions. I think it was $1 billion, a bit more than $1 billion that they can't account for. So what you're telling me is that the IRS can arrest me and put me in jail if my taxes are off, but they don't tell me how much I owe. They don't tell me how much I need to pay them. I have to figure that out. But if I get the wrong number, they can arrest me and put me in jail, but they themselves don't even pay their own taxes. And that's supposed to be a democratic nation? Give me a break. Give me a break. This is the problem. Again, this is a criticism of democracy. Democratic nations become so bureaucratic that they can no longer be democratically controlled, which is exactly the state. We have zero transparency in our government. We do not know what's going on, and we cannot control it in any way. And then number 10 is unfinished work and term limits. We already talked about the lack of a long-term vision within democratic nations because everybody's focused on election cycles. Well, the reverse side of that is because we have constant waves of election cycles every 2 years, major presidential cycle every 4 years, you cannot make major reforms because there's not enough time in between periods. At most, you get 8 years, and most of the time in between that, the Congress and the Senate flip-flop on who has majority. So in America, the major elections bring limits to any type of reform to the system itself. Oh, you want to limit the FBI? You want the FISA? You want them to no longer to have warrantless access on American citizens? Oh, too late. We've already passed that. Oh, by the way, that's probably going to take multiple years, and we have another election cycle, and that's not going to happen. So within our own structure, reforms and long-term projects like, building bridges, building roads, building the infrastructure of America, we can't do that because the election cycles are so quickly happening that nothing can actually be continuously done for a decade, 20 years, 30 years, unless the federal government decides that's what they want. But the populace themselves have no agency. We cannot decide to do something for the next 20 to 30 years. I mean, look at the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. Did America want to go there? No. America has been voting for the anti-war candidate for the last 100 years. The last 100 years. And so number 11, my final point, or I guess 11 plus one, my final point in regards to a criticism and the problems of democracy is that who is allowed to vote. And that's what I brought up earlier. Within Athens, it was only free Athenian men, typically that had service in the military. In America, they want illegals. And this is where the conversation, and I know it's controversial, and I'm not going to make a claim about it because we're on YouTube, but somebody like our sister Rachel Wilson has highlighted the problems maybe with the 19th Amendment and the suffrage movement and feminism and how things have been influenced. And we see that single women vote in a very predictable way compared to married women, single men, and married men. From the latest statistics that I've looked at, single men, married men, and married women overwhelmingly vote Republican. Now, we've already talked about the two-party system as being corrupt and inefficient, and it's really a false form of democracy. But even given that, the ideals, and we know that the Republican Party is an opposition party and that they're there to lose, and that's the whole thing. That's the whole thing. They're not going to do anything, right? I mean, Ted Cruz is still going on Fox News complaining about the border, and he's been a senator for how long? He's done nothing. He's done nothing. The Republicans are there to lose. But you see how married people and single men overwhelmingly want smaller government and more liberty, more freedom, whereas women and particularly minorities vote overwhelmingly for government expansion, for government safety, as opposed to personal liberty. And the question is then who should vote? And now we see that the many people in the country want illegals to vote, which has never, ever, ever, ever been the case within a quote unquote democracy to been something that would be promoted. Because the whole thing is that you have to have a certain group of people that are invested in the long-term interest of the nation state to be the ones that have agency. And of course, that's not it. So those are my 11 major criticisms of democracy and why it's problematic, and really why the fact that we in America don't really live in a democracy or a true republic, because we have no agency over the government. And then we looked at rule of law, mob rule, long-term stability, two-party system, influence of media and propaganda, bribery and corruption, free and fair elections, non-democratically controlled institutions like the intelligence agencies, lack of transparency, finished work and term limits, and of course, fair and free election. Who's able to vote. in these quote unquote fair and free elections. All 11 of these principles, we see that in the contemporary American context, they're totally undermined. None of them are supported. And all of these are essential to live in a quote unquote democracy. So therefore, do we live in one? I would argue we essentially don't. We essentially don't.